Clemson, number 14. They're playing number 1 Georgia. I opened this by asking, is it disrespectful to say that Clemson can beat Georgia outright? I've seen some questions out there in the interwebs. Folks probably of the burnt orange, or not burnt orange, but tiger orange persuasion, saying that no, absolutely not. Clemson has every right to be in this game. The rest of the SEC says that Clemson doesn't have a chance here. The line is 13.5. Again, this is Saturday, 11 a.m. on ABC. Where do you fall with that? Can Clemson compete and keep this interesting through 4 quarters?
I think they can. I think it'll be an entertaining game. I think it'll be more entertaining than when we saw Bo Nix come down to Atlanta a couple years ago and lead the Oregon Ducks against Georgia. That one was over pretty quickly, but I winning outright, I just have a hard time envisioning the formula. I think a lot of stuff would have to go wrong. You'd have to see a very similar formula almost to what I think Georgia Tech did to Florida State last week, where things just aren't clicking for Georgia offensively. The lines and the new guys on both sides are really not as advertised. And Clemson just plays a pretty much flawless game plan. I think that's the formula for Clemson. And I really see I have a hard time seeing a Kirby Smart led team falling to that level. And I kind of have a hard time seeing a Dabio Sweeney led team in 2024 rising to that level. And I think both of those things have to happen to lead to a Clemson upset outright. I just don't see it. Maybe one of you guys can paint me the picture because I'm struggling to see it.
Well, Garrett, if Clemson is going to beat Georgia, it's going to largely fall, I think, on the shoulders of Cade Klubnik, right? Finally, in his 3rd season, we watched him grow and regress and take those lumps last year. He was very good at times. He was very not good at other times for Clemson. I think a lot of Clemson fans will point to the fact that the offensive line had some struggles last year and his wide receivers were just not standout weapons. Oftentimes, his wide receivers could not get the separation that they were looking for, that Cade needed in order to feel confident delivering that ball down the field. He's got some ability to rush with his legs, but I don't think you're going to beat the Georgia Bulldogs with a rushing quarterback. This is going to have to be an offense that takes its shots down the field. So for me, my big question is, what does Cade Klubnik deliver in this first week? It's year 3 of getting significant playing time and being the starter. This is when he's got to step up.
Yeah, and I think the big thing with, anytime you get a young quarterback, right, like they've had the last couple of years, you want to find ways to put support around him to help him out, right? And really, Clemson hasn't done a very good job, I think, of putting elite level talent around Cade Klubnik, right? Now, you don't necessarily need to have, all future first rounders in order to succeed, right? I'm not saying that, but you do want to have guys who can compete at the highest possible level, especially if we're talking about playing a team like Georgia. So, the last couple of years when you have struggles on the offensive line, when your receivers don't really have that same talent level we've seen Clemson receivers have in the past, yeah, I don't blame Cade Klubnik for struggling in the beginning part of his career here at Clemson. Now, they've done a lot to take those excuses off the table. I think the receivers are in a much better spot than they were last year. I think that the talent they have, I think that the explosiveness that they have, I think is a lot better with those Clemson wide receivers this year. The question is now, okay, Cade, like, what do you have? It's time to kind of nut up or shut up, right? It's time for you to prove that you're the guy who was that top guy coming out of Texas, one of the top quarterbacks of that cycle. It's time for you to prove that you're that guy, or it's time to start to panic a little bit at Clemson because you pushed in all your chips on this kid who, up to this point has been solid, but solid doesn't win you the big games, right? He's been all right. He hasn't necessarily been atrocious for them, right? But those aren't words you use when you talk about beating Georgia. If we're saying that, if we come up here on Saturday night and we're talking, okay, well, Cade was all right, Cade played fine, then we're talking about Clemson not covering this spread and not being in this game. If we're talking about Clemson being a part of this game, it has to be, yeah, Cade took a huge step forward. Cade did a lot to keep them in this game. Cade made some big-time throws and some big-time spots to move the chains, right? That's what we're going to be saying if Clemson's in this game. I think he's going to take that step. I know he has it in him. He's a fierce competitor. He's one of those guys that, we'd say he's got that dog in him, right? The question has just been the last couple of years for me, what's around him? And I think they're finally putting some good stuff around him that should help him have some success against Georgia.
Trey, on the other side of the coin, it feels like it might be business as usual for Georgia. They've been elite at not only recruiting high school talent, but also plucking the best at various positions from the transfer portal, right? And Kirby Smart's on a roll in that recruiting landscape. Is there anywhere that you have a concern for Georgia heading into this game, or is it kind of all systems go?
I think my only concern, and this is really low hanging fruit and maybe like lazy sports talk, but are there cracks in the culture at Georgia? I think we're going to find out this Saturday. Much has been made about all the offseason drama, all the arrests that have been made. It seems like the same problem over and over and over again. I'm not necessarily one that buys in that it's going to affect on the field success necessarily, but it's definitely not a good look. And it could, I mean, it's a distraction, plain and simple. And we'll see if Kirby Smart is someone who can lead the team through the distractions. I tend to believe that he will. That's honestly my biggest concern about Georgia. We can talk about who they lost. They lost a ton of talent from the last couple of years.
Yeah.
They still have Carson Beck throwing the football. And I think that a lot of people undermine his talent as a college quarterback because of the talent around him. After he succeeds this year, they're not going to be any excuse anymore. He's going to be cemented as one of the top quarterbacks in the league and all of college football because of all the transition that's happened around him. So I'm not necessarily concerned about who they're putting on the field. I'm just wondering if off the field creeps into on the field. And we see a glimpse of that this Saturday.
I like the weapons that he has around him. Oscar Delp replaces Brock Bowers. Yes, they kicked Ra Thomas off the team, but the wide receiver core is still very, very deep at Georgia. Maybe a little, maybe a slight question about the front seven defensively. You mentioned they lost a lot of talent. Are they going to be as nasty as they've been in the years past? I guess we'll see. Clemson's a great opportunity for them to put any possible naysayers to bed, at least early on. Now, that schedule will bring about more questions as Georgia goes throughout the rest of the season. We've talked about it. Their schedule is absolutely brutal, and Clemson is the appetizer to that. For me, I want to see Georgia get back to forcing turnovers. They're actually only +3 in the turnover margin last year. I think if they turn over Cade Klubnik, it might be over early. Klubnik's thrown 21 touchdowns, 12 interceptions over the course of his career. If they get him uncomfortable, like they did with Bo Nix a couple years ago in that game against Oregon, Clemson, I don't think is going to have the willpower to fight back, right? Phil Moffitt is not going to beat the Georgia Bulldogs, shouldn't beat the Georgia Bulldogs single-handedly. So if Georgia can start getting Cade uncomfortable, forcing some errant throws, if you take away those dynamic weapons out wide, that I think is the path to success for Georgia. So we turn to our first pick of the 2024 season. Georgia -13.5 is the line. Garrett, we'll start with you. Which way are you leaning?
So I'm going to go Clemson to cover. I don't think they win this game, just to be clear. I think they're going to lose, but I think it's going to be close. I'm going to pick them to cover that 13.5. And really the reason why is because it's kind of twofold. Number one, first game of the year, and Georgia's trying to figure out who its playmakers are, right? You lose Brock Bowers. You lose Lad McConkey, some of the primary weapons you had last year. Now, I don't think Georgia's worried about who their weapons are. It's just going to be actually in the game, who's going to step up, who's going to be the guy that you can count on in those big moments. And so for me, I look at this and I say, okay, I think Clemson plus the 13.5, if they can kind of get out there, keep it close, a little bit of a defensive slugfest in the first half, maybe get your feet underneath you, then I think that they can keep this thing inside of 10 points. And I think that'll probably be where it ends up. I could see this thing being somewhere in the realm of, 38-31, maybe 38-33, somewhere in there. With Georgia ultimately coming out on top, but I do think that Clemson will keep it close and put a really good showing up.
I really like Clemson's defense, and so I'm also going to side with you here. I'm going to take Clemson plus the points. I think this is something like a 10-point game. Maybe I've got, I think officially on my notes, I've got Georgia 35, Clemson 24. So just inside that cut line. But yeah, Clemson. I think part of me wants to believe that Dabo's stubbornness is going to pay off, that his way of team building is going to work out. That's probably a fool's errand, and I'm probably going to regret picking them as my ACC champions. But I am going to roll with them just to stay inside that mark. Trey, you've got Georgia covering and winning this game comfortably.
Yeah, I've got Georgia covering this one. Guys, maybe I'm burned by Florida State last week, but I think with all of the big three in the ACC, Clemson, Florida State, and Miami, I just got to see it before I believe it. I got to see that this Clemson offense is going to move the ball consistently and score enough points to not lose by multiple touchdowns before I believe it. And so that's what I'm rolling with. I see it as a relatively low scoring game, something in the 28-10 range. Something like that. I don't think Georgia's going to score. I don't think Georgia's going to drop a 40 burger by any means, but I just don't know that Clemson's offense is ready to keep up against the Georgia defense.
Okay. 2 taking Clemson to cover. Trail roll with the Bulldogs. Just to be clear, we have Georgia. All 3 of us have Georgia winning this game. So we'll see if Clemson can keep it close, keep it entertaining. Again, that's kicking off on Saturday morning. That's the first taste of college football that we get on our initial Saturday here in week 1.
Gracious, how about that?